This is a lecture on the British empiricists, focusing especially on John Locke and the doctrine of the blank slate and how that comes to be received in more contemporary critical theory, looking at the work of Heidegger and Derrida. So this is going to be a very rapid, brief overview of the thinking of the British empiricists and the inductive method in contrast to the thinking of Descartes. Again, one could spend a lot more time on these texts, but the which are worthy of study, careful study in them themselves. The whole entire courses are offered on these philosophers. Here, we're merely exploring key concepts that will help us to better understand what's going on in contemporary critical theory today, and to be able to help us gain greater access to the writing of deconstructive thinkers like Derrida and Descartes. But that being said, Derrida and Heidegger. But that being said, we will cover this could, those of you who are watching it, could also provide you with just a basic introduction to inductive thought and to British empiricist epistemologies, or some ways of knowing. Okay, so let's begin. Again, as I said, I've entitled this Mr. Locke's Blank Slate. There's John Locke on the left. You can see he's a rather wispy, anemic-looking fellow, but hard to overemphasize his contributions to the world that we live in today, particularly a lot of his political philosophy that he wrote, which had, for instance, a direct influence on the shaping of the of American government. And when, for instance, when Thomas Jefferson speaks of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he's taking it directly from Locke, Locke who had said life, liberty, and property being these inalienable rights. Well, Jefferson transformed that, but he was very much steeped in the thinkings of Locke, who's a very important figure, a wonderful thinker of tolerance and education. So many ideas come down to us from Locke. So we're not really doing him justice here, because he's worthy of a lot of careful study in and of himself. But we're studying one particularly important aspect of his thought in order to help us understand more contemporary deconstructive thinkers. All right, so you can see there on the right a blank slate. And so Locke is going to call we're going to see in his rebuke to the thinking of Descartes, who articulates this doctrine of innate ideas. For Locke, there are no innate ideas. There's a very stern rejection of Descartes' thinking on this question. And he's going to say, by way of contrast, that the mind is a blank slate. Well, this, for Chomsky, for instance, who follows in the footsteps, obviously, of Descartes, and for the neo-Cartesian linguists who teach in American universities today, when students study linguistics in America, they tend to study the Chomskyan, paradigms, and Chomsky's going to reject this doctrine of the blank slate as simply ludicrous. But as we're going to see, the doctrine of the blank slate has a particular history that is worthy of taking note of. We're going to look at what Locke says in opposition to what Descartes and the Chomskyans say. Okay. All right, so deductive versus inductive reasoning, Cartesian versus empiricist epistemology. These are things you should be able to articulate. If you want to read Kant, for instance, you're going to have to know first these differences. And so these are terms, ideas that you should be familiar with, and pause for a moment and take some time to familiarize yourself with them before you seek to read the writings of contemporary critical theorists like Heidegger and Derrida. So we've already discussed in previous lectures the Cartesian method. We've talked about deduction, but before we delve deeply into the inductive method, let's just briefly review. We said that the Cartesian deductive method, or Cartesian rationalism, is a matter of reasoning from the general to the particular. And we said that the general is a kind of a thesis, an interior, internal thesis that is asserted. It's a thetic mode of argumentation, as opposed to, as we're going to see, inductive forms of thinking that are more questioning, because they begin with the particular rather than the general. And we're going to see that the particular is precisely the empirical trace, impression, or stimulus in the empirical external world. One asks a question about the trace rather than begins by asserting a thesis, like in the case of Descartes, the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, being his thesis, which he asserts. This is a quote from Descartes. Instead of the speculative philosophy, we said this is the teaching of the scholastics, the Thomists, followers of Thomas Aquinas, who Christianized Aristotelian thought, known as, and this is a theology known as realism. A practical philosophy can be found by which, knowing the power and effect of fire, water, air, the stars, we might make ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature. All right. Well, we said this is why Descartes is often linked to imperialist ideology, certainly to factory farming, because from this frail claim of the think that I am a thing that thinks, or I'm a thinking thing, I think therefore I am, the cogito ergo sum, Descartes thereby goes out and seeks to possess and master all of nature. Okay, now what is induction by contrast? And I allude here in passing to Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, who Voltaire calls the father of experimental philosophy. Bacon did a lot of amazing things. Very interesting figure. We're not going to look at him here very much, but I mentioned him in passing. He's certainly a person worth, philosopher worth investigating. But he's one of the things he's going to appreciate about Descartes, as do the other British empiricists, is Descartes' let's say deconstruction, to speak anachronistically, of the Aristotelian Thomist notion of quidditas, what Bacon would call occult quiddities, or this idea that there are essences concealed within things, which he's going to see, as do many other British empiricists, as is simply an unnecessary hypothesis. And so we'll agree with Descartes in that sense, but disagree with Descartes about many other things. So let's underscore here again that it's Descartes, precisely Descartes, who paves the way for inductive philosophy, even though he's not an inductive thinker himself. And this is this quote that we read previously: "It is better to use only what presents itself spontaneously to our senses, the impression or trace, empirical trace, of which we cannot remain ignorant, provided we give it even a moment's reflection, than to seek out more rare and abstruse phenomena." All right, well, we discussed this previously, so I won't dwell on it too much, but simply to note this is one of the most important passages in the discourse, and one that the British empiricists would certainly appreciate, because they share with Descartes a rejection of quidditas, of this Thomist notion of a quidditas, or this essence that is concealed within the world, the ontological world of objects. Okay, 100 years later, Voltaire, 1733. Voltaire is kind of a funny. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but I enjoy reading him, is what I mean. Wonderfully funny novels like Candide. But his value, I think, as a philosopher, is he very nicely, concisely encapsulates the thinking of the day, more than himself being the figure who makes a lot of philosophical discoveries like Locke or Descartes. But here's what Voltaire is going to say about Descartes. He says, "Very few people in England read Descartes, whose works indeed are now useless. Descartes was mistaken in the nature of the soul, in the proofs of the existence of God, in matter, in the laws of motion, and in the nature of light. He admitted innate ideas. He invented new elements. He created a world. He made man according to his own fancy. And it is justly said that the man of Descartes is, in fact, that of Descartes only, very different from the real one." And remember, Voltaire's here giving us a view that is his own, but it also He's encapsulating the thinking of many of his contemporaries. Descartes, pushed his metaphysical ideas so far as to declare that 2 and 2 make 4 for no other reason because God would have it so. He deceived himself, but at least he was methodical. He destroyed all the phantasms with which youth had been infatuated for 2,000 years. And this is, again, he's going to appreciate this fact. Voltaire, that is. He taught his contemporaries how to reason and enabled them to employ his own weapons against himself. If Descartes did not pay in good money, he, however, did good service in crying down that made of base alloy. All right, so in other words, he didn't really deliver the goods in terms of his epistemology that he offered the world, or his way of knowing the world, but he did do everybody a favor, putting it in more, again, anachronistic terms by deconstructing this occult notion of quidditas that persisted in the thinking of the scholastics or in the Thomist tradition. Okay. John Locke, 1632 to 1704. Now, Locke very concisely deconstructs, again, speaking anachronistically, the Cartesian doctrine of innate ideas, which he's going to reject. So there are no ideas that are innately hardwired into the brain, to put it in more contemporary terms, but rather the mind is, in effect, a blank slate. Locke's most important philosophical work is Essay Concerning Human Understanding, but he wrote many other important works, particularly on government, that are definitely worth your time. Okay, so let's begin thinking about what the inductive method is. I'm calling this the inductive method and the question of the question, which is partly linked to induction, or the British empiricism, which is, as we said, a matter of reasoning from the particular to the general, or one starts with the particular before one moves to any sort of thetic claim. Or any kind of more general observation. So, but what is the particular? All right, so these are terms, these are all sort of interchangeable terms to know in thinking about what Locke is calling the particular. We have the impression, the trace, the idea in Lockean terms, which is not to be confused with the Platonic idea, sensation, empirical stimulus. Deconstructive thinkers speak of what they call sukhi rest, which is the remainder, what remains, a residue, an ash, a vapor, a spirit, which is, again, put it in Derridian terms, the word for the ear, specter, word for the eyes. These are all sensory impressions, stimuli, traces that enter the body in an empirical and external way. Okay, so Locke's going to say that the mind is a blank slate. This is one of his most important doctrines, which is articulated in opposition to the Cartesian doctrine of the innate idea. How are ideas acquired, Locke asks? How does man come by them? I know it is a received doctrine that men have native ideas and original characters stamped upon their minds in their very first being. Again, we saw that in Plato, so it is a received, it's not just Descartes. It was long before Descartes. However, all ideas come from sensation or reflection. He's arguing, obviously, against Descartes. Let us suppose, then, the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety. Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience, in that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. Our observation employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that which supplies our understandings with all the materials of thinking. Okay, so we don't have ideas until we experience sensory stimuli, and we could think of the idea then as a kind of a weak stimulus. An idea is itself a stimulus, but is a stimulus that has been weakened or abstracted. But thinking, reflection is something that operates upon stimulus. But to think of or to imagine an idea that comes prior to our experience of the empirical external world is for Locke nonsensical. We are effectively blank slates, our minds, until we experience the traces of the real that we reflect upon. So we can think of the trace, whether we're talking about a smell, a touch, a taste, a sound. All of these are in effect. And he's using this metaphor of writing. We can think of the trace as an inscription, a kind of a writing upon the blank slate of the mind. Locke's going to say, our senses, conversant about particular sense objects, do convey into the mind several distinct perceptions of things. Thus we come by those ideas of yellow, white, heat, cold, soft, hard, bitter, sweet, and all those which we call sensible qualities. I mean, the senses from external objects convey into the mind what produces those perceptions. This great source of most of the ideas we have, depending wholly upon our senses and derived from them to the understanding, I shall call sensation. The source of ideas every man has wholly in himself, and though it be not sense as having nothing to do with external objects, yet it is very like it, and might properly be called internal sense. But as I call the other sensation, so I call this reflection. All right, so we have sensation and reflection. And by reflection, I would be understood to mean that notice which the mind takes of its own operation, and the manner thereby of reason thereby comes to be ideas of these operations in the understanding. We have nothing in our minds which did not come in one of these two ways. Let anyone examine his own thoughts and thoroughly search into his understanding, and then let him tell me whether all the original ideas he has there are any other than the object of his senses, or the operations of his mind considered as objects of reflections. He has not any idea, not one, in his mind, but what one of these two have been imprinted or inscribed, upon it, upon the blank slate that is the mind. Okay, so that's a nice idea. We've heard it before, I think, though. If you were attentive to our reading of Plato's the Cora. The Cora is also, Plato's going to describe it as a kind of a blank slate. This is going to be an idea in Aristotle. We'll in a moment, we'll take an inventory of where this idea appears in other philosophical works and the texts of other thinkers. So it's not by any means an idea that's original to Locke, but it's an idea that Locke is asserting against Descartes, from which, but drawing that idea from the history of philosophy. So the doctrine of the blank slate, again, it's a very, very old doctrine. There's nothing particularly new about it, but Locke makes it central in his thought. Now, another key empiricist is the great skeptic, atheist, philosopher David Hume. You can see here that his dates were, he lived from 1711 to 1776. Again, we're only very briefly alluding to these figures. We can't dwell on them too long. But his treatise of human nature is one of his more important texts, published between 1739 to 1740. An inquiry concerning human understanding, published in 1748. There were many others, but Hume was akin to Locke, but it was precisely, but he was perhaps the more radical of the empiricists, and he is the thinker who's going to, as Kant very famously is going to say, is going to awaken him from his dogmatic slumbers. Because when Kant, as a young man, reads the thought of David Hume very carefully, he's scandalized by the implicit atheism that he finds there, and this causes him to begin seeking an alternative philosophy. So Hume, although Hume's thought is by no means the same as the thought of Kant, it's precisely the thought of Hume which is going to spur Kant into developing an entirely new philosophy because of of the anxiety that reading Hume causes in Kant. Okay. Here's David Hume on the impression. This is, again, this key word. If you think of the painting, impressionism, this term impression, it's a very important word to know. It's another way of talking about the trace or the empirical stimulus. It's another articulation of the same thing. It's like what I talked about when the spectral image of the other enters your body on the lens of your eyes. That is an impression, okay? Or when a sound enters your ears, those are impressions. And so these are different ways of articulating the same thing. David Hume's going to say, every idea with which the imagination is furnished first makes its appearance in a corresponding impression. The latter perceptions are also clear and evident that they admit no controversy. Though many of our ideas are so obscure that it is almost impossible ever for the mind which forms them to tell exactly their nature and composition. 'Tis evident that all reasoning concerning matter of fact are founded on the relation of cause and effect, and that we can never infer the existence of one object from another unless they be connected together. So this is another key notion in the thinking of Hume, which we don't have time to go into too much here. But I just want to note here again, coming back to this idea of the impression, is that think of this when we say, like, for instance, how we say in colloquial terms, like, did so-and-so make a good impression on you? I hope I made a good impression. Well, an impression it's as if somebody comes into a room and you see them, and then you have a visual representation of them that enters into your body again via your eyes, and they walk away, and then someone asks you, well, did you see so and so? Do you remember so and so? Did that person make an impression on you? Well, if it was a very strong impression, then the image of that person would be more deeply implanted within you, and it would stay with you. This is why, again, the impression is also, say, in Freudian thought, is a trauma. So an impression that's very deeply inscribed in you is a trauma that you cannot forget. But if somebody just leaves a room and you saw them but you really didn't see them, then it was a very weak impression. But either way, again, it's a matter of a sensual stimulus literally coming into your body. Okay, and so for Hume, it's just everything that's out there in the external world in this sort of cause and effect sense. As he says here, it is evident that all reasoning concerning matter of fact are founded on the relation of cause and effect, and that we can never infer the existence of one object from another unless they are connected together. This is a very sort of purely empirical, external epistemology, a way of thinking about objects, one that Kant is going to be very disturbed by. And he's going to say, well, he's not going to want to go the metaphysical route of Descartes and claim that there are innate ideas, but he's also finds this way of thinking about the empirical external world as problematic, because he's convinced that there's operations going on in the mind that are quite different from what Hume is describing here. Okay. There's George Berkeley too, for whom Berkeley, the town of Berkeley, where the University of California is named after. But I'm going to focus here instead on David Hartley, because I think his articulation of the impression is a very accessible one that can help us to understand what we're dealing with here. And so he lived from 1705 to 1757. His most important text was various conjectures on perception, motion, and generation of ideas. All right, so let's see what Hartley says. Okay, so Hartley is going to make a distinction between what he calls complex and simple ideas. And Hartley is going to say those ideas which resemble sensation are called ideas of sensation, and also they might be called simple ideas in respect of the intellectual ones which are formed from them, and of whose very essence it is to be complex. The simple ideas of sensation are generated because the most vivid of these ideas are those where the corresponding sensations are most vigorously impressed. most frequently renewed, whereas if the sensation be faint or uncommon, the generated idea is also faint in proportion. Okay, think again of the idea of the impression in Freudian terms as a kind of a trauma, a scar in effect. So an impression that is so deeply inscribed upon us that it wounds us is a scar. And so a scar too is a trauma, but an impression is also a kind of a trauma in the same way. But if we're not deeply impressed, then if the sensation is faint, then the idea itself may also be faint. You say, in extreme cases, evanescent and even imperceptible. These ideas are copies and offsprings of the impressions made on the eye and ear. Sensations remain for a short time after the impression is removed, and those remaining sensations grow feebler and feebler until they vanish. And it seems reasonable to expect that if a single sensation can leave a perceptible effect, trace, or vestige for a short time, a sufficient repetition of sensation may leave a perceptible effect of the same kind, but of a more permanent nature. Sensations, by being often repeated, beget ideas. Okay, and so I like to let me use an example that from my own personal experience. So when I was of what he's talking about here, when a number of years ago I lived in Burkina Faso, and I had my daughter who was about 2 or 3 at the time was there, and she grew up there for a while. And she was every day when we were living in Ouagadougou, she would see donkeys being pulling carts down the street. And so when we moved back to the Pacific Northwest, when she was about 3 or I guess 4 at that time, she saw for the first time a deer. She'd never seen a deer before. And she called the deer. She said, "Look, Daddy, it's a donkey." Right? Well, it was kind of funny, but you can sort of see in the way that Hartley is describing this here that that we form a concept through repeated experience of particular sensations. So in this case, she had seen a number of donkeys, and after seeing 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 donkeys, she formed, in the way that Hartley would put a concept of a donkey. And then when she saw a deer, which was kind of a brown figure, which somewhat looks like a donkey, she subsumed it under this category of donkey because she had no prior experience of a deer at that time. So I hope that helps to illustrate, what Hartley's talking about here in terms of how we get concepts or ideas from the impressions of sensory stimulus. Okay, let's continue. All right, so I want to focus for just a minute now. I want to come back to this idea of the blank slate as in terms of its conceptual history. Again, we're always following Jameson's mandate. We're always historicizing. We'll see here that there's nothing particularly new about this blank slate, and claims like of the Chomskyians, for instance, that this doctrine is outrageous, are simply oblivious to the history of philosophy that have accompanied this concept that's been handed down to us for hundreds and hundreds of years from antiquity. So this is a very old idea, as we're going to see. All right, but to review, what is imprinted on Locke's blank slate? Traces, inscriptions, sensory impressions of the external and empirical world. So let's review a quote we've already read from Timaeus. Plato says, in speaking of the chora, that placeless place, that empty stage where the being of beings discloses itself to us, he's going to say, if an imprint is to present a very complex appearance, the material on which it is to be stamped will not have been properly prepared unless it is devoid of all characters which it is to receive. All right, so we're saying here in metaphysical terms that the doctrine of the blank slate is very akin to the doctrine of the chora. So we're back to our basic concepts of metaphysics, being and non-being. Now, one of the reasons why it's somewhat ludicrous to say that the doctrine of the blank slate is preposterous or unworthy of thought is that we cannot have a thinking of time unless we have a thinking of non-being, because time is always our time, our temporality. The core is linked to the question of our death. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, in Chomsky's thought, there's almost no thinking of time at all. And the thinking of time that's there is very elementary, very basic, and not conceptualized in any profound way at all. And this is partly because there is no thinking of nothingness in Chomsky. There is no thinking of the blank slate. It's simply dismissed as a ludicrous concept. Okay, now here are some images of blank slates. You can see the blank sheets, the white sheet of on the far right, the blank white pieces of paper. You need those white pieces of paper in order to the condition of, another way to say this is a condition of the intelligibility of the inscriptions that you write on the white sheet of paper, are the blank spaces in between the characters. I look for a minute at the image in the middle. I used to refer to this in my classes because I used to, this will date me, but I had these kinds of writing pads when I was a kid, and you would write on it, and you would pull it up in the writing on this little thin transparent sheet. It would make the writing disappear. And it would leave an impression in the black slate that was underneath it. And I used to like to use this as an example of Cora trying to understand what the blank slate is in my classes. And nowadays, none of my students know what I'm talking about when I mention that, because I guess nobody has these kinds of things anymore. When I was a kid, these were very prevalent. All right, so tabula rasa, Aristotle's De Anima, are on the soul. Here is the way Aristotle is going to think of this same thing. And so this doctrine of the blank slate is also, we find it in Aristotle. All right, so again, it's a very old concept. Mind is, he says, in a sense, potentially whatever is thinkable, though actually it is nothing until it has thought. What it thinks must be in it, just as characters may be said to be on a writing tablet on which nothing yet stands written. This is exactly what happens with mind. Okay, and I want to note here also the Aristotelian soul here, as we've said, and we were talking about the animal, is not just linked to the rational man. The soul is something that for Aristotle, not for Descartes, but for Aristotle, there are vegetative souls, there are sensitive souls, like the souls of animals. That's my dog Shia, by the way, there. And then there are rational souls as well. And so man is the rational animal. But Aristotle doesn't dream of voiding, animals or even, vegetables, even, things plants that grow, of the soul. All of them are ensouled in Aristotelian thought. Okay, philosophers of nothingness. Okay, so you can see here, if we look back in the history of philosophy, there are a lot of philosophers who thought about Cora, tabula rasa, or the blank slate. We've mentioned Plato's Cora, Aristotle's tabula rasa, but we find it in the Islamic tradition as well. Ibn Sina, who we've talked about earlier, Avicenna, Ibn Teufel, author of a wonderful book called Hey Ibn Yaqsin, which was Daniel Defoe borrowed from when he wrote Robinson Crusoe. But in Teufel's version, it's a more sort of meditative, philosophical tale, and it's obviously in the Islamic context. And Thomas Aquinas has this thinking as well in his philosophy. And so when we look at more contemporary philosophers like Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Jacques Derrida, Helene Cixous, Julia Kristeva, all of them have a thinking of a thinking that is akin to the thinking of John Locke when he calls it the blank slate. They use different terms for this, and I'm not suggesting they're all exactly equivalent, but I am suggesting that if you want to read contemporary thinkers, it's like these deconstructive post-structuralist thinkers, like, let's say, Christophe or Derrida. It's, if you have some background in the basic concepts of metaphysics, they're going to be a lot easier to read. Now, as John Caputo says, différance, which is an important Derridian term we'll come back to later, is a kind of a Sir word for Quora. It's very, we could think of it as a kind of a conceptual retooling of Quora, in which the doctrine of the blank slate or the choral abyss gets a little bit more conceptual rigor brought to it by Derrida, but we'll come back to that. Okay, is John Locke's blank slate a ludicrous doctrine or ludicrous idea? Let's read Heidegger on the question of non-being and science's rejection of the exploration of the question of the Quora. Heidegger is going to say, why do we trouble ourselves with nothing? The nothing is rejected precisely by science, given up as a nullity. But when we give up the nothing in such a way, do we not concede it? Can we, however, speak of concession when we concede nothing? But perhaps our confused talk already degenerates into an empty squabble over words. Against it, science must now assert its seriousness and soberness of mind, insisting that it is concerned solely with beings, i.e., in the realm of becoming. The nothing, for what else can it be for science, but an outrage and a phantasm? If science is right, then one thing is sure. Science wishes to know nothing of the nothing. Ultimately, this is the scientifically rigorous conception of the nothing. We know it, the nothing, in that we wish to know nothing about it. Science wants to know nothing about the nothing. But even so, it is certain that when science tries to express its own proper essence, it calls upon the nothing for help. It has recourse to what it rejects. What duplicitous state of affairs? Okay, let's continue. Whoever talks about nothing, Heidegger says, does not know what he is doing. This is from, the last quote was from his book, Pathmarks. This is from Introduction to Metaphysics. In speaking about nothing, he makes it into something. By speaking in this way, he contradicts himself. But self-contradictory speech is an offense against the fundamental rules of speech, or logos, against logic. Talking about nothing is illogical. Whoever talks and thinks illogically is an unscientific person. Now, whoever goes so far as to talk about nothing within philosophy, which after all is the home of logic, deserves all the more to be accused of offending against the fundamental rule of all thinking. Okay, now note here he's being ironic, of course. Such talk about nothing consists in utterly senseless propositions. Moreover, whoever takes nothing seriously takes the side of nullity. Perhaps he's a nihilist. He obviously promotes the spirit of negation and serves disintegration. Talking about nothing is not only completely contrary to thought, it also undermines all culture and faith. Whoever both disregards the fundamental law of thinking also destroys faith, and the will to construct is pure nihilism. But here's his rejoinder to this kind of voice that he's creating of the rejection of nothingness. In asking the question of nothing, or let's say the blank slate, the quora, the abyss, we stand within a tradition. For philosophy has constantly and always asked about the ground of beings. With this question, it had its inception. In this question, it will find its end. The question about what is not and about nothing has gone side by side with the question of what is since its inception. Okay, now another way to say this is that hostility to inquiry into the question of the nothing, into the question of the blank slate, the claim that it's simply ludicrous and not worthy of reflection, fundamentally amounts to a disregard, a contempt for philosophy itself. We've already seen, for instance, in the case of Chomsky, that he, views, people that ask him questions about the metaphysical foundations of his own thought as simply, harassing him. But philosophy has a lot greater tasks than to harass Mr. Chomsky. Philosophy has been around for 2,500 years, and it's always been accompanied by this question of what Aristotle is going to call the law of non-contradiction, or this question, Hamlet's question, being, non-being. And whether you reject metaphysics or you embrace metaphysics, you can't think, you can't do philosophy, you can't do critical theory unless you're aware of its history and how it has been accompanied by inquiry into the question of non-being. It doesn't make you a nihilist to pose the question. It makes you instead a human being. The question that a human being who poses the question, what Heidegger is going to call the first in rank: why are there beings rather than nothing at all? Okay. All right. So I want to move now into a brief discussion of Leibniz, and that is, that because Leibniz is going to give a different, response to Locke's embracing of the doctrine of the blank slate. And Leibniz is going to be more critical of the doctrine of the blank slate, but he's going to articulate his criticism in such a way that it doesn't completely negate metaphysics. In fact, it's predicated upon metaphysics. And Leibniz is a particular, he's a bridge thinker in terms of, as we move from, say, the empiricist or Descartes, for instance, to Kant. Reading Leibniz can help you to better understand Kant, or can prepare you for better understanding of Kant, which then can prepare you for better understanding of Hegel and Marx. Okay, now we said earlier Leibniz was the inventor of the step reckoner, the first calculator. He was which is sort of the prototype of the computer. He was also the inventor of life insurance. But let's see what he does with in his response to both Descartes and Locke, as he moves to a more, what I would say, a kind of an early kind of a position or a point of view that's going to anticipate the thinking of Kant. So here's Leibniz on Locke's blank slate. He's going to say, "I am nowise in favor of Aristotle's tabula rasa, for there is something substantial in what Plato called reminiscence. We have not only a reminiscence of all our past thoughts, but also a presentiment of all our future thoughts. Thus, it is true in a certain sense that not only our ideas, but also our sensations spring from within our soul, and that the soul is more independent than is thought, although it is always true that nothing takes place in it which is not determined, and nothing is found in creatures that God does not continually create." Now, Leibniz is going to take a more overtly theological perspective that Kant's going to distance himself from, but much of what he says here is going to be replicated in the thinking of Kant about, what later come to be a priori, categories in Kant, that are different from, this more sort of a posteriori thinking that we find in the empiricists. But here's Leibniz on Locke and Descartes, and this is a really revealing quote on Descartes, and I think it's you can focus on this as a kind of formulaic way, and it can it's said, there's a lot is said here in this one sentence. Leibniz is going to say about Descartes that Descartes failed in a twofold manner. First, by doubting too much, and by too easily desisting from doubting. Okay, another way to say that is he doubted too much, and he doubted, and he gave up doubting a little bit too, easily. So in the first case, he was too doubtful of the empirical world of the stimulus or the trace, the impressions we've been discussing here. But, he gave up doubting a little bit too hastily when he made this claim to existence and asserted his cogito. So Leibniz's, criticisms of Locke's doctrine of the blank slate also come with criticisms of Descartes, both which are going to be embraced by Kant. And so Locke's going to say, what Leibniz is going to say on Locke, my book that he's writing considers chiefly the principles said to be born with us. Mr. Locke does not admit them any more than he admits innate ideas. He has doubtless good reasons for opposing himself on this point to ordinary prejudices. Okay, or in other words, Leibniz is agreeing that, Locke, this is such an abused doctrine that, Locke is right to be, critical of the way that this doctrine so easily circulates. For the names of ideas and principles is greatly abused. Common philosophers manufacture for themselves principles according to their own fancy. And we might think of Chomsky's universal grammar, Jung's archetypes of the collective unconscious that are, sort of rehashing of these Cartesian doctrines of the innate ideas that are bolstered with evolutionary claims to science and so on. And the Cartesians who profess greater accuracy do not cease to entrench themselves behind so-called ideas of extension, matter, and of the soul, desiring to avoid thereby the necessity of proving what they advance. Okay, for instance, think of Chomsky's hypothesis on universal grammar. I shall only say there that true or real ideas are those whose execution we are assured is possible. The others are doubtful, or in the case of proved impossibility, chimerical. Now, the possibility of ideas is proved as much a priori by demonstrations, by making use of the possibility of other more simple ideas as a posteriori by experience. For what exists cannot fail to be impossible. Okay, now if you've had any introduction to Kant, you'll know that these terms from Leibniz are going to enter into Kant as well. But here Leibniz is, it's there in the thinking of Aristotle as well. And so Kant, following Leibniz, is going to try to articulate what we're going to call later sort of a dialectical epistemology that accounts for both a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge, the knowledge of experience. So in effect, synthesizing the thinking of the Cartesian rationalists and the British empiricists into a new syncretic system which incorporates the best of the thought of both. All right, so here's Leibniz. I do not therefore find it absolutely essential for the beginning or for the practice of the art of thinking to decide the question of whether there are ideas and truths born with us. Okay, note here. So it's not, we don't need, we can decide not to decide, or we can leave aside, the question of whether there are ideas or truths born with us or not. This is very, again, this is echoed in Kant's thinking when he sort of decides not to decide about, or he suspends, let me put it that way, he suspends inquiry into the question of metaphysical grounds. Is going to say it's more appropriate for, the realm of the private as opposed to the realm of the public, or what the task of the public philosophers to do. This is sort of the beginnings of, liberalism in Kant's thought. Whether they all come to us from with or from ourselves, we will reason correctly, provided we proceed in an orderly way and without prejudice. The question of the origin of our ideas and of our maxims is not preliminary in philosophy. I think I can say that our ideas, even those of sensible things, come from within our own soul. All right? So here, just briefly, let's look for a moment just to clarify the difference between Kant's a priori and a posteriori knowledge. The a priori is knowledge independent of experience. Here's an example. I could say if I walked for more than 3 miles, then I walked for at least 2 miles. Okay, let's compare this with a knowledge that's dependent on experience, the a posteriori example. It's snowing outside. Now, this is a knowledge claim dependent upon external empirical verification, as opposed to a knowledge that doesn't require external empirical verification but comes from thinking. This is the a priori. Okay, now Leibniz also gives us the principle of reason, which is nothing without reason. I mentioned this as well as an important aspect of Leibniz's thought. Heidegger is going to say about this that the double negation here yields an affirmation. Nothing that in any manner is without a reason. This means that everything that is, every being whatsoever, has a reason. Okay, so again, we said there were two main principles we're following through as we're looking at these various thinkers: principle of non-contradiction in Aristotle, principle of reason. And here it is articulated: nothing is without reason, which is to say, this double negation shows, as Heidegger is going to say, that every being has a reason. Now, for Heidegger as well, everything has one way of thinking about this is there's a reason for everything. This is Leibniz's theory, thinking of he's a providential philosopher. For instance, in Voltaire, in Voltaire's Candide, he has this figure Pangloss, who's this eternally optimistic philosopher, kind of a brutal parody of Leibniz's thinking that the providence is behind everything that happens, and for everything there's a reason, so we can be sure that God is in charge. And Voltaire kind of savagely parodies this. But Heidegger's point about the principle of reason is not to affirm a kind of a naively Panglossian philosophy of optimism, but to remind us that reason implies a ground. And so to say everything has a reason is also to say for everything there is a ground, which is to say a metaphysical foundation. This is what Heidegger is going to say is slumbering in the principle of reason, and in the history of philosophy. This principle doesn't come to be articulated for a very long time, and it's Leibniz who finally articulates it. And Heidegger has a very nice book on this called The Principle of Reason. It's a short book. It's a wonderful book. I recommend you have a look at it. Okay. So Heidegger is going to say, then, what is the reason for the principle of reason? If everything has a reason, the principle itself behooves us to ask this question. He points out here something turns on itself. Here something coils in on itself, but does not close itself, for it uncoils at the same time. Here is a coil, a living coil, like a snake. You can see there the snake, Ouroboros, the snake who swallows its own tail. Because what Heidegger is observing here is that what's paradoxical about the principle of reason is it asserts that everything has a reason, but it can't give us a reason for itself. So what is the reason for reason? And since we don't have a reason for reason, we have this I think what Nietzsche's going to call the tragic perception, where reason curls up upon itself and we realize it's insufficient. This is like if we think, for instance, of we saw in the last lecture, we were talking about when Chomsky's pressed to ask where does language come from, he has to have recourse to art. He has to have recourse to storytelling, because reason itself is inadequate to the task. And this is what Nietzsche again will call the tragic perception. This is from his early work, The Birth of Tragedy, but it nicely encapsulates what we're talking about here. Nietzsche's going to say, science spurred on by energetic notions approaches irresistibly those outer limits where the optimism implicit in logic must collapse. Every noble and gifted man has, before reaching the midpoint of his career, come up against some point of the periphery that defied his understanding, quite apart from the fact that we have no way of knowing how the area of the circle is ever to be fully charted. When the inquirer, having pushed to the circumference, realizes how logic in that place curls up and bites its own tail, he is struck with a new kind of perception, a tragic perception, which requires, to make it tolerable, the remedy of art. For instance, in the example we just gave, hence the necessity for Chomsky to resort to art, to the telling of stories, since he has no way of giving a reason for reason. Reason cannot give an accounting for itself. And this is not because it's any sort of weakness in Chomsky's thought necessarily. This is a basic metaphysical question. Reason has to be rendered And for everything, we know that there is a reason, but reason can't give us the reason for reason. And so we're left with this kind of conundrum. All right, so here's again Heidegger on Leibniz. Nothing is without reason. What does this principle say? It says being and ground reason belong together. This means that being and reason are in essence the same. The principle now says that everything that counts as existing only when it has been securely established as a calculable object of cognition. The principle of reason is the fundamental principle of rational cognition in the sense of reckoning that securely establishes something. Okay, back to truth that is calculable. Okay, so as we come to the end here, I note a few questions for further discussion. One question that we're going to need to reflect upon as we think about dialectical the subject-object dialectic in Kant, which enters into the thinking of Hegel and Marx, is there a forgetting of being in Kant, Hegel, and Marx? And one of the things we'll see is that Heidegger is going to say that in the case of Kant, Kant is very much aware of the question of being, even if he brackets it off in effect. But his system is nonetheless predicated on metaphysics. In the case of Hegel and Marx, their thought comes with the claim to having superseded the necessity of inquiry into the question of being or metaphysics. For instance, Marx is going to claim that he's made a break from metaphysics, and this is one of the reasons why Marxist thought is often called theory, critical theory, as opposed to philosophy, because again Marx is going to insist that he's going to say that hitherto all the philosophers have thought about the nature of reality. The point is to change it. So he's not interested in posing the question of what is the nature of the real. But for all that, does he then therefore get out of metaphysics? And in Derrida's Spectres of Marx, we're going to see that he does not in Derrida's reading, not always in any case. I mean, there's some places where he seems to move beyond a kind of a metaphysical thinking in Derrida's reading, but there are other places where he seems fully ensconced in a kind of a metaphysics of presence in a very classically Platonic and Hellenic sense. Okay, are modern philosophers, Hegel and Marx, oblivious to the metaphysical grounds of their thought system, or have they really and truly succeeded in breaking from metaphysics as they claim? Okay, we'll end on that note, and I will see you in our next lecture.